If you have previously viewed my films, then you already know almost all of the fantastic prophet has thrown a pall over the year 2025. However, as we deduced, these prophecies have left behind another one. A finding surfaced that made everything seem even more foreboding. A Zen master's forgotten prophecy who lived more than a millennium ago. Man is considered to be among the 7 greatest seers in ancient Chinese history. Hango Zun was his name, and within a nearly extinct collection of classical 14 prophetic words from the poems he left behind, surprisingly, 12 out of 14 have already occurred, leaving just 2 to go, and one of them includes a forecast that describes a momentous occasion in the year 2025. So what precisely happened? Let's find out what the ancient monk predicted. Please buckle up for today's story, as we explore the mysteries of today. But initially, you may have amazing good luck if you previously liked and subscribed. This video concludes throughout Europe, and Nostradamus' name is frequently cited as the ideal prophesy symbol. But in the East, there's a person who is equally admired by later generations. A man was recalled as a profoundly enlightened monk, but as a prophet whose visions were eternal. Zen Master Hango was his name. Zun, based on historical documents, lived during the Tang dynasty in China about a millennium ago. Although Hango was not in the traditional sense of the word, he didn't go from one community to another, giving vague speeches or making promises of salvation to the general public. Instead of withdrawn from society, committing his devotion to asceticism and contemplation, he felt that only by relinquishing global ties may one actually understand the fundamental nature of the cosmos. However, his existence was anything but dull or disengaged from history. Rather, it was his exceptional capacity to connect the worldly and religious, which made him such a unique person. On one basis, he allegedly hit the future Tang's Emperor Xuanzong directly across the face, a shocking act of disobedience intended to instruct the new ruler regarding humility and compassion. In any culture, a monk who is willing to hold up his hand to a future monarch is an uncommon and bold move. It showed that Hango was more than just a spiritual hermit, but a guy whose vision defied the constraints of his time period. When Xuanzong eventually took the throne, rather than take revenge, he gave Hango the impolite monk a satirical Dharma title, but an extremely revered name. The emperor personally mandated that every one of the lessons taught by Hango will be recorded among a compilation of 14 poetry that foretell. Every verse resembled a fragment of history composed in a sophisticated classical language, rich in symbolism and somewhat mysterious code that, in reality, would only be discovered by future generations. That nobody could have predicted. 800 years later, these apparently harmless verses would start to appear with terrifying precision from the autumn of the Ming dynasty to the Qing, between violent civil upheaval and the golden Qianlong and Kangxi Yongzhang's ages. Each significant development in the lengthy arc of Chinese history was predestined as though Hango had held time in his verses, itself in his grasp. Yet what's still there? What really amazes current scholars is the information concealed in the last 2 poems, an allusion to 2025 specifically. Why would a master of Zen from more than a millennium ago leave behind a prophetic message? Traces of a year that was much longer than his own and, even more fascinatingly, why this identical year frequently show up in the visions of prophets and mystics from all various regions of the world, apart by geography and culture over centuries with no relationship between them. Now let's proceed to the following section to examine the origins of Zen Master Hangbi, anticipate the future in the broad span of antiquity. The Ming dynasty in Chinese history encompasses frequently recalled as one of the final enormous Han Chinese empires with accomplishments in the field of culture, science. The Ming was previously regarded as a magnificent apex of Eastern civilization, yet as with all the splendor and past that finally would lead to greatness, fade. The most astounding thing is that this powerful dynasty's demise might have predicted 800 years prior in the final remaining prophetic poem behind the Zen master. In his poetry, Huanggo made reference to disturbance of the moon and sun, 2 heavenly signs that are not coincidental. It closely resembled the official symbol of the Ming dynasty itself. The representation of a moon and sun's chaos acted as a strong allegory for a kingdom in decrease, and as the Ming arrived, its last years of collapse turned into evident in natural disasters at all levels. Stricken by a series of unrelenting famines dispersed throughout the country, corruption aggressive and festered inside the court. Uprisings broke out with increasing intensity. The populace no longer trusted their leaders. Farmers rebelled and formed divisions inside the government turned against all others, scurrying for the last power. The Manchu armies loomed to the north like a dark tempest assembling at the Licheng, which borders to the south, was once a soldier who became a revolutionary, marched his peasant army headed for Beijing with determination to take the throne, followed by the unavoidable occurred in 1644. Under Licheng's command, he entered the capital. In that eerie historical event, Emperor Chongjin, the final Ming dynasty ruler, took his life under an old tree as though providing a final repentance to the he had failed his forebears, which defies. The rationale is that Hango's poetry featured appeared to have foreseen this precise fate, not only the actual fall, but the pictures that moment and the unchangeable tone catastrophe. Yet the prophecy continued. Beneath the grief of collapse, Hango alluded to something more than movement greater than that of any one ruler or empire for the end of one era. Inevitably, another starts, and like dark before the daybreak, the descent of the Ming signaled not only a conclusion but also a warning of what was about to happen. From its ashes, the Qing dynasty emerged, bringing about a significant change in the China's power culture and perhaps its future itself. However, what still worries academics? The strange reality of today is that everything, the death, the upheaval, and the regime shift, was clearly written in that initial hundreds of years prior to any of it. The poem arrived at period following the Ming dynasty's collapse. China began a new era under the Qing Empire was established by warriors initially from the northern boundary. Numerous denied that the Qing was a patchwork system, not having the splendor and sophistication of the Golden Age. The Golden Age was arrived prior to the emergence of a youthful emperor. Someone who would keep a whole court silent has become renowned as one of the most intelligent rulers in history. Kongyi, from the east, was his name. He took the throne when he was only 8 years old. That would turn into the lifeblood of an empire for almost 60 years, and what is nearly unbelievable is that this remarkable ruler's destiny had already predicted in the second poem by Zen master Huanggo that foretells, composed hundreds of years before Kongyi was even born. In contrast to what some people would think, Kongyi didn't grow up amid affluence or pleasure. Rather than growing up in a court full of power and manipulation battles, at the heart of this chaos Oboy was one of the four regents, right? Assigned by the former emperor to manage the realm when the boy was a little boy. However, Oboy had consolidated authority for himself, taking over as the de facto leader of the empire, even though Kangyi was referred to as emperor. Oboy was the one who made the threads that nobody anticipated, but was that the young monarch will eventually become using his own hands to turn the tables in 1669? At the tender age of 16, Kangxi planned, in a brilliant move, he asked Oboy to the palace while feigning to share tea while laying the groundwork for a trap that had been meticulously prepared. In a surreptitious way, Oboy lifted his cup, unintentionally dropped it, and did something that in the rigorous manners of the era were regarded as a serious disrespect to the monarch. Grabbing hold of the signal, Kongyi gave and security personnel hurried to apprehend the once instantaneous, unassailable regent. In one well-considered action, a teenager took overthrew the most influential person in the court. That further shocked academics was more than just Kongyi's prophecy, ascension, or his audacious move of taking back power, but something much more specific. Additionally, Hango's poem had foreseen the precise duration of his rule. There is a line in the second verse mentioning the 61-year rule, and it was Kangxi did, in fact, hold his eventual rise to the imperial throne among the emperors with the longest reigns in his reign was a turning point in Chinese history, of power, stability, and culture blooming just as the poem had described, predicted. The fourth of Zen's prophetic poems, Huangbo, the master, predicted the rule of Kaiyan Long, the emperor, who would elevate China reaching the height of its regal splendor just to put it on a downward trajectory that quickly trailed behind the Kaiyan Long's brilliance. He rose to the throne in 1735, taking over not just the crown, as well as firmly established the basis of political power and military might that he swiftly established. The empire's boundaries were extended by authority. That brought about the Qing dynasty's numerous. Think about the ultimate height of power in the history of Chinese imperialism under his. China ruled over huge swaths of territory, had an impact on the surrounding countries and their people, went through a unique and cherished period of prosperity, and similarly to the fourth poetry of prophecy, said Huangbo foresaw that Qianlong would first rule for 60 years. Many people thought this prediction was Qianlong himself had stated that he wouldn't reign for more than 60 years as a show of deference by declining. He will surpass his 61-year reign in Emperor's Granddad. As promised, Kangxi appeared in 1795 at the Qianlong abdicated at the age of 85 and gave his son Yongyang the throne, who would rise to become Emperor Jiang, while in reality was more intricate, even if he took down in name. Qianlong kept using real authority operating behind the scenes as the retired Emperor Taishang Huang for 4 more years before he passed away in 1799 when he gave up the empire was already moving into a violent decline, but Qianlong had previously a model sovereign. His subsequent during those years, superstition and a risky acceptance of corruption, the once vibrant court becomes swollen and slow, and the splendor of its zenith was gradually lowered by the expanding shadow of collapse after all. After Qianlong's passing, China faced growing crises brought on by domestic uprisings and economic decline to rising. The industrialized powers pressure of the West and, despite its strangeness, it appears that all of this was already centuries of silent poetry. The prophetic verse was ahead of its time. Of the master Hango after the Kai's luminous splendor. Long ago, China's history took a fresh page, one that hinted at the approaching disaster and crisis, and as a reiterating a caution for centuries, the Zen master's 5th prophetic poem, Huanggo, signaled the start of this descending spiral that resembles a deep red dragon. Based on the Chinese calendar, the red dragon is symbolized by the year 1796, corresponding to the emperor's accession, Jiang. This was the time period that Hango predicted as the start of the contemporary Dark Era in China, and, in fact, that was the case in reality. During the Jiaqing dynasty, the Qing dynasty initially faced serious systemic failures are the most common. The White Lotus Rebellion was a catastrophe, a huge rebellion led by a religious folk movement that spread throughout vast areas and lasted for almost 10 years. Unchecked corruption spread, and the bureaucratic system became more and more weak. Jiaqing was in power for 25 years prior to passing away in 1820 due to illness. Britain was already free of its. China's first industrial revolution stayed isolated, holding on to its ancient policies of cultural and trade exclusion superiority. This arrogance would let in what turned out to be one of the greatest catastrophes in contemporary Chinese history. Historically, the British were motivated by growing demand from customers and a desire for trade planned what was only possible. Characterized as a smuggler's soft invasion, opium into China while pretending to be trade. As millions of Chinese people fell into addiction, the social order started to break apart in 1839 when confronted with the Emperor Dao Guang declared a state of emergency. Lin Siku was sent to Guangha to conclude the opium trafficking is a spectacular demonstration of Lin destroyed more than 20,000 in disobedience. Opium chests exposed to the public plaza, which led to the first opium. In 1840, war with Britain started, and with its powerful military superiority, Britain was swiftly vanquished. The poetry of China, Hango, composed in the 9th century, seems to predict not only the particular outcomes, but the trajectory of a whole society from the Jia's initial fishes. From the Qing period till the fall of the empire power under the poetry by Dao Guang sounds as if it were a warning bell, saying that when an empire doesn't want to change, the world will change without goes throughout numerous. Zen Master Huangos. One cannot avoid reading prophetic poetry, but observe a pattern that is remarkably accurate. 12 of the 14 poems in all have occurred, leaving just 2 veiled in doubt and as destiny. As it happens, the 13th poem includes an allusion to the year 2025. If the prophecy comes to pass, something could change the world's order in methods beyond Huanggo's use of imagination. In that poem does not cite any emperor without naming a dynasty. Rather, he writes as though conversing directly to the human race. The information is as follows. In the year of the world is reeling from the West plague will once more see the ascent of one from. By the year of the snake, everything in the South will go back to the center. In accordance with the conventional, the year of the rat on the Asian calendar aligns with 2020, the year of the snake through 2025. However, what really makes me shiver is not the mere reference to these years. It is how contemporary history has started to unfold nearly precisely as predicted. In 2020, the world was enthralled with. Life froze due to an extraordinary pandemic. Cities were silent, resembling images from The world economy collapsed during the conflict. Grief permeated every home and many started talking about Hango's predictions. Now that 2025 has arrived, the question remains, what will happen next? The West will see a power emerge from this line invites numerous people from the South. Interpretations that it might allude to countries' geopolitical shifts from perhaps the global South is becoming more influential. It makes reference to social crises such forgotten villages recover their voice, or it might allude to spiritual and changes in culture were novel. Currents of thought start to question the enduring foundations of Western, a sign of democracy that the world is not longer than it was previously, and that perhaps the core of human history is changing. Chinese history buffs are aware of. China has traditionally seen itself as the Middle Kingdom as the focal point. The cosmos revolves around everything. Thus, when Hango's prophecy mentions everything, he might be going back to the center, suggesting that China will make a comeback as the leading power in the world, or does. This portends a more serious potential third world conflict as cited in further prophetic narratives. China's victory means that we have already observed the breakdown of the September trauma in the Soviet Union 11th, the financial crisis of 2008 and the history has never shied away from the 2020 epidemic, away from abrupt turns, but in 2025 possibly different from anything we've seen before. It might be a significant turning point. It might be a novel idea in human society, either the start or the finish, but regardless, it arises from the decisions we make about how we live. Our actions and beliefs that will help us weather the world's storms is actually evolving. Then let's be those who make positive changes. If humanity's destiny really rests on our hands, allow us to keep it in place. Overlooked since Master Huangbo, what comes next, he wrote in his last poem, must be inquired of those who follow in. In other words, regardless of how things turn out, future hands are constantly involved, generations with the ability to influence. A more optimistic world if the tale of the day even caused you to pause just to take a time to consider the all prophesies murmured over the centuries, then express your ideas in the remarks below, and remember to click subscribe to activate the alert bell. I'll see you in the following tale.